lesson, we'll be talking about ways to actually develop project ideas that are meaningful to students and how to craft driving questions that can guide the direction that the projects take. We'll be focusing on not only the project idea and the driving question, but also how we can avoid breakdowns during a project-based language learning experience. As Russ has already mentioned, one of the key challenges in the field right now is helping teachers figure out how to move from all of the work that has been done in other disciplines regarding project-based learning to integrating that into a language learning environment. The national standards and the 21st Century Skills Map produced by ACTFL are two tools that are incredibly helpful to us. But I guess I want to preface this presentation with the idea that a lot of these things are still being worked out. So although it would be nice if we could give you hard, fast, concrete rules and answers, which teachers tend to like, the reality is that some of these ideas and principles are things that will give you some inspiration to go experiment and explore in your own classrooms and then report back to us in terms of what is working for you. But one thing that we do know is that some paths to proficiency are faster than others. This page comes from the ACTFL 21st Century Skills Map, and it sort of compares and contrasts how we have looked at language teaching and learning in the past versus what we are focusing on today when we think about a more proficiency-oriented approach as opposed to one that simply focuses on teaching grammar and vocabulary. And so in a proficiency-oriented approach, we give opportunities for students to use the language. Our classes are learner-centered. We are really emphasizing the idea of learners as doers and creators, and I think that is a really key piece of planning project-based language lessons, is that the teacher has to start thinking in terms of what students are going to do, not what the teacher is going to teach. We use language as the vehicle for teaching content, and that is a major shift for a lot of language teachers. And so over the successive modules in this online institute, you'll be learning how to do that. We are focusing on engaging students with real-world tasks that get them using language beyond the classroom, and these are really key elements as we're thinking about the projects we might want to engage students with. And finally, we want students to have opportunities to share and publish to audiences that go beyond just the teacher. So with that, let's look at some of the different types of projects that you might choose to implement in a class. One of the great things about project-based language learning is that you can really tailor and adapt it to your comfort level as a teacher. So if you're not ready to launch into something that asks students to communicate with native speakers from the target culture using tons of technological tools, there are baby steps that you can take that will progressively move you toward approaches that develop students' proficiency a little bit further. Here are some of the options. So first of all, we might just give students opportunities to inquire. And that could take the form of a research paper or a project, but a more dynamic version would be engaging students in an experiment or some kind of exploration. We can have them make things or produce products, and ideally we want every project-based learning experience in a language classroom to have some sort of product that students produce. In other words, that they're engaged somehow using the presentational mode of communication. Opportunities for students to serve the people around them, whether that's by having them work on a problem that needs to be solved or engaging in some sort of service project. And we want students to have opportunities to perform the things that they're learning, or to share might be another word for that. And so teachers who aren't quite ready to jump into more authentic kinds of projects may find themselves more comfortable trying to engage students in a performance or a simulation of some sort. What all of those different types of projects have in common are several key indicators of quality. So we're going to look at some of the pieces of projects now that are high-quality project-based ideas. The first is that every project needs a powerful engine. Just as a car does not go anywhere if it doesn't have an engine in it, a project in a language classroom is not going to go very far or be very motivating, which is one of the concerns we get a lot from teachers. Well, how do I make sure that students are motivated to do this and that they want to participate? And a big piece of the answer to that question is to what extent have you yourself or in conjunction with your learners selected a meaningful question or problem or challenge that really motivates them to want to go somewhere, that makes them want to drive that car. And just as when we are in a car, it's not quite as much fun to go places in a little tiny four-door sedan as it is in a sports car with a V8 engine. Our selection of question, problem, or challenge really determines kind of the size of the engine of the project. And the more powerful the question or problem or challenge, the more motivated learners will be to drive the project or the car. That links to our second characteristic, which is the idea that high-quality projects need good power steering, or in other words, they need a meaningful purpose that directs the project. So we can have a great question or a great idea, but if we don't have a clear purpose for why we're engaging with that question or that idea or considering that challenge, if we don't have something we hope to accomplish by the end of the project, then it's likely that we might not quite make it to our destination because we really don't know where we're going. And so generating a meaningful purpose as we're thinking about our projects can be very helpful. A third piece is the idea that high-quality projects are geared to produce some kind of a useful product that serves whatever purpose we've selected. So we'll look at some examples of this here in just a minute, but just as a car, when we're driving a car, particularly a stick shift, we use different gears for different purposes. If I'm going up a steep hill or down a steep hill in icy conditions, I might put my car in a lower gear. And so we want to make sure that whatever product we are selecting for students to produce is actually well aligned with the purpose rather than just having them generate something for the sake of accountability or a grade. Which leads us to our last point, which is the idea that high-quality projects, sorry, I keep confusing those two words, are designed to be meaningful to a public audience. And this is something that teachers have a hard time organizing when they're first starting with project-based language learning quite often, because we are so conditioned to expecting that whatever students turn in is for our eyes only, that what they turn in is for the purpose of accomplishing a grade in the gradebook or checking off some sort of checklist, performance checklist, as opposed to giving them tasks that actually have them produce things for real people for a real purpose. And so even teachers who aren't feeling up to the task of having students participate in an entire project, even if you will just think about how could I tweak the assignments that I already give so that they are asking students to do something for a real audience with a real purpose, you will find that students suddenly become much more motivated to do the things that you are asking them to do in class. So to recap, quality projects have some sort of powerful problem, a meaningful purpose, a useful product, and a public audience associated with them. And a few modules from now, Lauren and Liliana will be talking with you about the product square, which or the project square, which will help you to kind of think through these 4 elements as you plan your projects. When these characteristics are in place, as we mentioned before, those generate successful projects that motivate learners to want to take action and to want to be involved. So how can we find meaningful project ideas? There are lots of places, and it really is simply a question of noticing problems and possibilities. I think a lot of times we think we have to go on this big, giant, extended journey with all kinds of switchbacks and that it's going to be this difficult, onerous process. But finding meaningful projects can happen simply by paying attention to your own environment. Thinking about, as you're driving along, what concerns or interests or intrigues you? What is it that your students come in excited about or upset about or angry about? What is it that your school is, what kinds of challenges or problems is your school wrestling with? What kinds of issues are currently in the news regarding your community? And what's going on in terms of current events in the nation or the world that your students might find it interesting to explore or to become involved with? Another way to frame this would be the idea that students really can make a difference even though they are quite young in some cases. And so asking yourself, what is it that you or your students want to change about the world? How could you change it? And a lot of times when we think about that question, we're thinking about giant, major initiatives. And I would encourage you, as you think about that question, to think about what would be the very first step that I would need to take with my students in order to begin to change this particular problem or issue. And then finally, thinking about who can help you. Who are some partners or community organizations, whether that's other teachers or other classrooms or people in the target culture, technological companies. Who are people who can help you start to initiate those changes? So let's look at some concrete examples. This is an example of a teacher who noticed in her own classroom environment or in her own school that enrollments in French classes were decreasing, particularly in relation to Spanish. And as the enrollments were dropping, that was influencing the sustainability of their upper level programs. And so this high school teacher's question was, how can we increase enrollment, both to save the program and to save the upper level classes? And she turned this into a project for her students that gave them opportunities to start exploring what are the issues that are affecting enrollment. And so you can see here, she generated some basic questions to kind of start getting them thinking about the issue. How do the benefits of language learning transcend the specific language studied? How is French every bit as valuable a language choice as Spanish? Why is studying a foreign language important? What are the benefits? How does being bilingual have value other than college requirements? So she's getting them thinking about the conceptual issues related to this topic. And then she generates some questions that are designed to sustain inquiry. So why are more students taking Spanish? They're going to have to do some exploration to find that out, some research, some surveys, some interviews. It could take any number of forms. How can we convince people to take French? And what are the benefits of taking French? Now, ideally, when we're participating in a project-based language learning experience, we want a single driving question that's going to kind of guide the entire project, but you might have sub-questions like these. And then you'll notice that she set up a website to literally scaffold her students' progress through this project. And all of these links will be posted online after this webinar for you so that you can explore them in more detail. So looking at our own classrooms, we can also connect to cultural contexts. There are a number of teachers who have looked at challenges that are that target culture populations are facing. One such challenge might be the idea of healthcare. And so in this case, the driving question is, how can we improve the quality of healthcare? Now you'll notice that this question does not say how do we improve the quality of, or how can we improve the quality of healthcare in the Dominican Republic? Because the idea when we're doing project-based language learning is that we want to have a cultural component to it that allows students to explore cultural products, practices, and perspectives. But we also want them to compare and contrast that with what's going on in their own culture. And healthcare is an issue here in the United States, just as it is in the Dominican Republic. However, the issues sometimes take different forms, and the consequences may be different depending on the cultural circumstances. And so a question like this or a project like this gives students the opportunity to really start to begin to explore what are the issues. So for example, in the case of this project, students start to find out as they partner with organizations that are kind of like Doctors Without Borders, that in this particular city, a clinic, a very small clinic, it wasn't even a full hospital, served 40 to 60,000 people. It was only staffed by volunteer doctors from other countries who could only come when it wasn't the rainy season, because that was the only time that it was accessible to them. And people would walk for days in order to get to the clinic to be treated. And a lot of people were being treated for wounds and things, scratches on legs that had gotten infected, that they didn't have the knowledge to take care of themselves. And if they had understood about disinfection, or they had understood basic principles of how diseases are transmitted, or any number of other things, so in other words, the healthcare and the quality of the healthcare was also tied into issues of literacy and poverty and economics, just as it is in many ways in this country. And so this kind of a project gives students the opportunity to start to explore the issue of healthcare and to use their language skills and their and their exploration to develop cultural knowledge, both about their own country and the way that things work, as well as about the country that they're exploring. And so the important piece here when we pull in the cultures piece is that we make sure that we are creating projects that give students opportunities to learn from the target cultures as well as to help the target cultures. We can accomplish similar things on a more global scale. So, for example, I could take any number of global issues, and you'll notice that if we start thinking in terms of our curricula, the Advanced Placement Language and Culture curriculum, there are global themes already set up for us, and each of those themes have a variety of recommended contexts that we could engage students with. And as we find global issues connected to those contexts, those are great sources for project ideas. One example might be this project that a teacher was concerned about helping the world to gain a more nuanced perspective on Arab cultures, particularly given the issue of globalization and a shrinking world where people have to come into contact with one another on a more regular basis and where information is disseminated so quickly through technological means, that it's important for people to understand not just the language but also the culture, and that people don't paint a culture with a single broad brush. And so this is an example of a simulation, actually, where the teacher is having learners assume various roles within the Arab culture in order to provide a perspective about the Arab culture and then produce a product related to what they've learned. So obviously, in order to do this, students are going to need information, and that means they're going to have to read culturally authentic materials. They might engage in conversations or interviews with various people who fulfill these roles in a real Middle Eastern society, you know, in the context of Middle Eastern society. And they might be exploring these things from the perspective of people who live in different countries in the Middle East in order to gain a multifaceted, nuanced perspective about what this means. And then they're going to share their learning with the world. In this case, she asked for a multimedia PowerPoint, but this could also take on forms like a public service announcement or a talk at a Rotary Club, or in any number of other things. And finally, and probably most importantly, a great source of project ideas is to ask the learners. And so I want to give you some quick examples. This is a project that was begun by an 11-year-old who was very concerned about the state of sea turtles. He grew up in Florida initially and was very concerned about preserving this dying species. And so he started giving public talks in his community, eventually generated a little kind of coloring book, basically, about sea turtles that has information about them. And that book has since been translated into 6 different languages and has had more than 3,000 copies produced. This child is now 14 and is heavily and actively involved in a variety of service organizations related to environmentalism. So notice the driving question here is, how can we educate people about the importance of preserving sea turtles? Lest you think that that's an isolated example, I found this fascinating. I've started collecting stories of young people who are choosing to make a difference in their world in their free time. And so very quickly, I just want to orient you to some of the things that these kids are doing on their own. A 10-year-old decided that if they would have people, instead of collecting Halloween candy, they would have them gather money that could be used as donations to take care of a variety of social issues. And they were able to raise $5 million in 3 months. Kids gave up their Halloween candy in order to do this, and it generated tremendous support across the United States. A 7th grader built a Braille printer from Legos that dropped the cost of producing printers dramatically and significantly in such a way that they are now accessible to people in countries where economic issues and hardships are a problem. A 16-year-old invented bioplastic from banana peels. A U.S. teen invented an advanced cancer test just by Googling information. An 8-year-old decided, as a result of a challenge issued by her teacher, that she was going to try to make a difference every day for 25 days. She started off by doing things like shoveling somebody's walk, shoveling the snow, or gathering cans and then turning in the proceeds and donating that to charity. And by the time she was finished, she had gathered a public audience on her blog, had raised thousands of dollars for charities. And I just visited her blog again today, and she is now entering college and has continued her service work throughout her life. An 8-year-old decided that he was going to come up with projects to pay off students' school lunch debt. A French student studying French vocabulary decided that he really was kind of cheating himself using his flashcards because even if he got them wrong, there was no consequence. And so he created a game called Quizlet that has now a staff of 7 people and has expanded throughout, the country. And he's now studying at MIT. A little girl who was diagnosed with brain cancer decided that she wanted to donate money to Make-A-Wish and found out that for every $1 people donated, Make-A-Wish would donate $1. And so her goal was to raise $1 million for them. And a teenager raised $52,000 to start a school in Colombia, I think it was Colombia, after she had to be homebound for a little while and realized how much she enjoyed school. So the point here is that these kids are doing these things on their own. They already are wanting to change the world. Imagine what you could do with a student load of 150 students in a K-12 school or in a community college if you put them to work on real-world problems and helps them to develop their language and culture skills in the process. There are other sites that you can look at to see information, and as I said, I will post the links to all of these stories for you. So now we're ready to quickly shift gears to how we craft a powerful driving question. A powerful driving question has these different characteristics. First of all, it's going to give direction to the project. So we don't want it to be so open that we have no clue where we're going. We have to have some sort of ultimate destination. It's going to make our students curious. They're going to want to think about whatever it is that that question is asking. It's going to engage them in exploring real-world contexts, ideally. It will be open-ended. It's not going to have a yes or a no or a right answer. More specifically, it's going to have multiple possible answers that cannot be Googled or found in a textbook. Now, students might Google to assemble the answers and synthesize them into some sort of response to the question or challenge or problem. But we don't want this to be something that if they just Googled, they could know the answer, which is typically what we do in kind of our typical classroom projects. We want the question to frame and bound exploration. So by looking at the question, we should be able to tell what it is that we are doing and what it is that we are not going to focus on for this particular project. And that might mean that you're going to leave some things for future inquiries or exploration. We'll know it's a good project if it motivates inquiry and action amongst students. Do they bubble with questions? Do they explore on their own? Do they rush in when class begins to tell you what they've learned about some aspect of the project? Those are good signs that you've found a powerful driving question. It will motivate communication, specifically encouraging students to describe, to narrate, and to hypothesize, or in other words, some of the key language functions that are critical for developing high levels of proficiency. And last of all, it's going to invite students to try new things, and it's going to encourage you to try new things. In the interest of time, I want to quickly skip this slide, but you can look at it later, and talk quickly about the process for crafting an effective driving question. So we're going to start with our textbook, and we need to identify a conceptual anchor. What is it that's going to matter to our students and that's going to engage them in thinking about or exploring the culture, in thinking about how the culture connects to other disciplines and to their own experiences, and that will motivate them to produce some kind of product that is creative or that transforms society in some sort of a way. And so we can do this by having students expand, or by expanding our textbook topics. So teachers who don't just want to run out into the world and find a project idea can start with your textbook. So start by saying, okay, maybe art. So how does that connect to social issues and cultural contexts? Well, for example, many Spanish-speaking painters or artists took on the social problems of their day, and they depicted those or commented on those, whether that was the Spanish Civil War or whether that was, inequities in the lives of the common people versus the nobility, and they painted about those things. And so we might think about some kind of a driving question that relates to art as social commentary. If we're thinking about grammar topics like the present subjunctive or preterite versus imperfect, finding a conceptual anchor like childhood or the popular media, and then thinking about how does that connect to the cultural context. And so I'll let you explore these on your own, but I want to quickly show you what the progression would look like because we're just about out of time here. So I might take a topic like school, and my conceptual issue or anchor is then going to become education. Social problems related to education might be literacy, and the cultural context might be studying languages so that we can participate in a 21st century globalized society. And then our driving question is, how can we increase enrollment in French classes? We use the same process for the other guiding questions that you saw earlier in the presentation. So I might move from a chapter about body parts to the conceptual anchor of health and hygiene, exploring the social problem of healthcare, the cultural context of access to healthcare, both in the Dominican Republic and in the United States. And the driving question is, how can we improve the quality of healthcare? So I'll let you read through the rest of those on your own, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that Senora Spanglish has generated a variety of driving questions for novice learners of Spanish, but her questions are in English so that you can see. Project-based language learning breaks down for lots of reasons. The main issue is that we don't include enough fuel. We don't let it be complex enough to be conceptually interesting or cognitively challenging. We don't let students do real things, and so it's not emotionally engaging. We don't have them collaborate, and so it's not socially satisfying. Or we don't involve the learners when we're preparing or planning the projects, and so it's not personally empowering. And so we need all of these aspects, not only for to make motivating projects, but also so that students have what they need to develop advanced levels of proficiency. So if we incorporate 21st century skills as we're thinking about our project development, that can be very helpful. We are out of time, and so I will let you take a look. The rest of the slides are pretty self-explanatory. They talk basically about the World Readiness Standards and how we might forget pieces of those and what the consequence is, or these are kind of questions you can ask yourself to evaluate your own projects as you're thinking of ideas. We'll skip through these to the end here. And I want to leave you with this thought. As we're thinking about projects, we want to think about where it is that we want our learners ultimately to go with their language, what we want them to be able to do in the world with their language. And the things that we just test them over without giving them opportunities to really use their language for meaningful purposes are things that don't ever have enough power to stick with them, to transform them, or to change the world.